What's up, YouTube? So today I want to talk about something that kind of builds on an idea that I was talking about in my previous music theory video, but you don't necessarily have to watch that one. I want to try encompass this in its own entire video. Obviously, I would appreciate the watch if you are thinking about more videos to watch after this one. Anyway, the idea today that I want to talk about is the kind of difference between harmonic music and modal music. So this is something that I kind of discovered doing a bit of research into Western music theory and music theory that kind of predates Western music theory. And it's also something that I've noticed a lot of newer psytrance producers struggle with, specifically who are coming from a different genre background, who know a little bit about chord progressions and traditional Western music theory. It's something that I've noticed a lot of those kind of producers struggle with. And it's also something that I think is particularly interesting because of where psytrance has its roots. So the idea that I want to talk about today is to kind of forget those traditional chord and harmonic Western music theory ideas that we know and try kind of simplify it in terms of the overall composition, and specifically if you're making psytrance, so and psychedelic kind of genres. For other stuff, maybe disregard this, but I found that this was a particularly freeing idea that I started working with, because once I started doing this, it opened up the borders for microtones, which is something that's particularly difficult in Western music because of the harmonic structure of it. So anyway, the idea with modal music is to have just a single fundamental note as opposed to harmonic music, which has a chord. The chord would then govern what notes can work over that chord. And because the chord consists of more notes than just a single note, obviously, each of the notes that then accompany that note can be either more or less dissonant. And that kind of constriction basically removes anything microtonal. It also very much kind of governs what notes you can choose for a lead line and that kind of thing. With modal music, it's a little bit simpler in terms of the overall composition, but the beauty is not necessarily in the notes you choose and the overall composition. It's more in the overall macro arrangement. You know, for example, if we had a chord, we could maybe choose 3 to 5 notes that might work with that chord. Whereas if we have a single note playing, we have an entire scale that can work with that note. And furthermore, we can switch between different scales at different times. And that's where the beauty comes in terms of the macro arrangement. So I want to do a couple of examples here. This is something that I've been working on that I kind of just discovered now that was really cool. And I thought this could be the kind of, focus of this video. But we're going to work on a kind of more traditional arrangement shortly. You'll notice that the traditional arrangements in terms of the chord progressions and that kind of thing tend to give you a more trance, commercial trance, vocal trance, uplifting trance, that kind of sound. Whereas when you go with a modal system, it tends to give you a more psytrance sound. And I think it's due to, obviously, the roots of psytrance. Psytrance comes from Goa, which is in India. And a lot of Indian music doesn't use Western music scales. It uses microtones. It uses very complex note structures. Sometimes the octaves are divided, instead of 12 semitones, into up to like 24 and up higher than that as well. So the notes that you could choose, for example, on traditional Indian instruments are very different to the notes that we would choose on, for example, a piano. There's notes that don't exist and vice versa. And it's not just Indian instruments. It's all instruments that kind of predate Western music. If we look at Arabic music and Middle Eastern music and Mediterranean music, a lot of it contains microtones, and a lot of it revolves around the modal system, just a single droning fundamental and flourishes of all sorts of melodies and rhythms on top. And I mean, when we break it down and we think about it, the psytrance bass is generally just a single note. When we listen to a lot of references of psytrance, it's just a single note. And that droning note is very similar to the low frequency drone that you hear in a lot of modal music. just the kind of compositional idea, one low note, lots of notes on top. Just for a quick reference, if we look at a Eastern-style baglamas, I think this is often referred to as a saz, very similar instruments though. If you look at the frets on this, it's not like a guitar where the frets are kind of evenly spaced. They're these clusters, and there are also quarter tones. So not just, a C, C sharp, and D. There's a C half sharp, C sharp, D half flat, D. Do you know what I mean? So there's lots of notes in between the notes to choose from, specifically when you're playing this instrument. And if you look at the oud, which is the predecessor to the lute, which is the predecessor to the guitar, it was fretless. And a lot of the music that was written for the oud consisted of microtones. Again, to a lot of this kind of music you can't really do within the Western music scale because those chords would sound dissonant with microtones. You understand? And I'll make that example shortly. So here, I've loaded up a baglamas within UVI workstation, and I've actually set up a system with a switch. So it switches between an oud and a baglamas. So here I'm using the micro pitch system. What this does is it allows you to take an incoming MIDI and shift it by every amount of semitones that you need. So instead of playing an E, it's playing, I think that's an F quarter up, and then F half sharp. And so there's basically a bunch of microtones in between some of these steps, but then some of the notes just don't exist in the scale. So you can actually see here how the clusters, I've kind of set up the clusters in that system. I was kind of just going by ear here and seeing what works. And, when you listen to it on its own, it's kind of weird, like what's going on. It just sounds kind of random. But then with that like lower drone, i.e. the kick and bass, it kind of grounds us so that the top just becomes these kind of like heavenly melodies on top. Okay, so that's the first example. We can use notes that technically don't exist in the Western music scale. We can use those notes if we use this kind of modal system. Just simplify the composition, how many layers there are in terms of how many notes there are in those layers, and think about the macro arrangement. Don't think vertically, think horizontally. Does that make sense? So here, let's create something that's maybe more Western. What I'll do is I'll mute this, and we can take out the bass notes, and we can replace it with like a progression, right? 8, 3, 7. Now, in terms of like what kind of stuff we can have on top of that, we could have a melody that arpeggiates that, right, and does a kind of scale, or we could choose chords, right? So we're already confined in what notes or what chords we could choose, because traditionally it would have to kind of all work together. That progression would have to move together, unless you're doing like experimental jazz and that kind of stuff. But if you are, you're probably not watching this video. So here it already feels like we're limited in terms of the notes we can choose with this chord, because we have this minor, and because it's a minor to minor, it doesn't quite work. A lot of progressions kind of require this movement between minor and major. And also because it revolves around longer notes, the B is very dissonant to the root note, which is the C in this example. And it just doesn't quite work. So a melody could have that B in, but the chord doesn't quite work with that B in just for me personally. Obviously, it's a subjective thing, but I find when working with a more harmonic system, I run into these things very often. Like, oh, this doesn't quite work. This doesn't quite work. Whereas the modal system just seems a lot more freer for the type of music that I'm creating. So here, let's go minor to major, and then let's fill out the rest of the chords. Okay, so now in this example, let's say we wanted to create some kind of lead line, right? So almost every time the chord changes, like we're kind of limited to the notes that we kind of have to focus on with that lead. If we had to, for example, try drag in this microtonal thing, the first run sounds fine, but the moment that chord changes, it just goes completely off. But it's because that chord kind of governs the intervals which are going to sound harmonious to our ears. Do you know what I mean? And so I guess it's a good system if you're looking to create that kind of music. But it's not the only system. There are several hundreds of other modes and scales, and all sorts of other more historical ways of creating music that kind of go further back, that maybe aren't as complex in terms of the way we might notate it, but perhaps can be a little bit more expressive if you're just creating dance music. You know what I mean? But yeah, this also gives you a kind of sound. It kind of creates that kind of more trance, commercial trance kind of sound. Do you know what I mean? Whereas just keeping the bass line on a single note, maybe doing some flourishes here and there for fills, but keeping the bass line kind of rhythmic, a single note, and then doing the experimentation on everything else on top. Let's say, for example, load up like something like Vital and see if this microtone thing here works with like a lead sound. Do you know what I mean? We have to just enable MPE here and set this to the same bend here. Remember, this is using notes that technically don't exist in the Western music system, but it sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, to me, to my ears, it sounds good. And so I'm going to use it. You know, that's what matters, I guess. Cool. That about sums it up. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. I will see you guys next time. Cheers.